Hey guys, today I'm going to do a quick tutorial just showing you how to put together a simple weather system using some common events that utilises a random number generator. There's plenty of scripts out there that let you do this. They're probably easy to implement, but I don't personally like scripts. I think if you've got little knowledge of scripting, then you're in a bit of trouble when it comes to, customizing this. This common events method allows you to do pretty much what you want with it, which I will show you in future tutorials and explain a little bit in this one. So here we go. One thing I would say, make sure you do something like this before you really get into producing your game. It makes sense because common events, which is what we're going to be using, can interrupt other cutscenes, for example. You don't want weather changes happening when there's some sort of big fight going on. And again, certain scenes you're not going to want rain going on. So say you've just walked into a house, you don't want it raining in the house. You need to be able to, set up events throughout your game that will turn off the weather system when you go out, when you go inside. So what we're going to be using for this particular system is three switches, two variables, and three common events. So, first thing we're going to do, we are going to look at common events. Now, like I said, you need three of them. The first one we're going to be looking at is a system known as Weather Countdown. Now, all we need to know right now is that I've named it Weather Countdown. It doesn't matter what you name it, as long as you know that this is the event that counts down the time between your weather changes. So, say you want to set it so that there is 10 seconds between each change in the weather, then it is this common event that will do it. Now, this system is unique because it varies the amount of time between weather changes to a certain degree. Now, I say to a certain degree, I'll explain that in a minute. You need to make sure that the trigger is parallel. This is very important because this is an event that will take place in the background. It needs to be a parallel process that runs in tandem with other events. Set it to auto run and the game will essentially jam itself, not allowing itself to run any other events because this is happening on its own. And we need to set a condition switch. I mentioned we're using three switches. The first one we're going to use is weather timer. Basically, this is so that you can turn your common event on and off simply by flicking a switch, as opposed to calling a common event every time. I personally think it's simpler this way, but you might have your own method. So the first thing we need to do, you'll see here that there's a control switch which turns an event called weather change off. Now, set that up. We all know how to do that. Just go weather change, turn it to off down there, go OK. Now, I'm not going to explain really what that's doing. Essentially, let's assume that you've already had several weather changes in your game and you don't want the game, once it's changed the weather, wants to keep trying to change it. You want the weather to change, then for the timer to start again until the next weather change. That's what turning this switch off does, okay? Very simple, but very important. So the first thing you want to do, we are going to create a control variable. Now, basically, we need to create a single variable called weather timer, okay? And this variable is going to be a random number generated between 0 and 4. Now, you can make this number as high as you like. As long as it starts off with 0, you can make that up to 50 if you like. But for the sake of making this game quick, I'm going to say 4. So what does this mean? Basically, between 0 and 4, you have 5 different instances. 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Makes 5. Each instance in this specific case is going to be a different time period between weather changes to emulate the idea that the time periods are randomly created, when in fact the time periods are already predetermined. It's which time period takes place that's randomly generated, if you know what I mean. So next thing we're doing, we're going to use some control branches. The first here, this is quite a long control branch. It looks a little bit complicated, but actually it's very simple. The one we need to look at is this first one here. So conditional branch, variable needs to be variable 1 weather timer, the random number generator we just created, needs to be equal to 0. Now, what does this mean? Basically, it means that when the number generator picks 0, this conditional branch will realise that and this string of events will start. Say it picks 3, this conditional branch will realise it, and this will start. Now you wonder why we've got 0 to 4 when we only go up to 3. Now think, I've said we've got 5 instances, 1, 2, 3 and 4. We can only ever have 5 instances, which means the else of this conditional branch is our 5th instance. We don't have to tell the variable system to look for number 4, because if it's not 0, 1, 2 or 3, it will have to be 4. It doesn't really matter if you follow or not, it's just a point. So the next thing we need to do is set a control timer. So in this instance, for the sake of testing, I've said various times between 10 seconds and 14 seconds. This is basically the countdown timer until the weather is going to change. Now you can set this to be invisible or visible, whatever. This will be visible for this instance just so you can see how it works. But again, you can make that 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever you feel like. It's 10 seconds for the sake of testing, just because I don't want to sit here for 5 minutes and wait. So the first thing we're going to do, make sure these are different. You can make them as wildly different as you like. I've made them quite close together just for the sake of it. But again, this will give the impression that the numbers are randomly generated. Next thing you need is your control switches. So once we're going to say your variable has hit number 2, for example. So conditional branch number 2 is lit up, it started a countdown. Now once 12 seconds expires, you want the switch weather timer, which controls this event, to turn off. Basically, you want the timer to stop for a minute, and you want the control switch weather check to turn on. Now this is the common event weather check that is controlled by the condition switch weather check. Again, it's a parallel process, so it runs in tandem with other events. Now weather check is basically the event that verifies whether the timer is at 0 or not. So this timer has started counting down. The timer event, basically to stop the timer from constantly restarting itself every second, is turned off. The timer is still counting down, and the weather check event turns on to track when the timer hits 0. Now, when the timer hits 0, then the control switch will turn on. Now this control switch is weather change. This is basically the change weather event that is controlled by the weather change condition switch. So we hit 0, this common event begins because the switch has been tripped. And again, it's a parallel process. So the first thing the game needs to do is turn off weather check, basically to stop a loop from happening. So all of this stops happening, it knows it's at 0, this now begins to happen. Now here's where we also get a certain random aspect. Not only is the time between weather changes random, but the actual weather change that takes place will be random as well. So we're going to have another control variable, this time weather effects. So we used weather timer before, weather effects this time. And again, we can set a random number. Now this time I'm using 0 to 3 because there are only so many different types of weather you can use. You can, technically speaking, have varying severities of weather that make up more numbers in your random number generator. That's completely up to you. So the first thing we need to do is set the first one 0 to a no weather event. Say you just want it to be a nice sunny day and you don't want rain, you don't want sleet, you don't want snow. Then you need to make it so that the weather effect is set to none. Now basically, when your game first starts, if you've got no weather at all, then it doesn't really matter that much. But if you are halfway through the game and it's currently raining and you want the rain to stop, you need this set weather effects none. And again, now I haven't set weather effects, I've set text to tell you which kind of weather it is, simply to save time. But you can set pretty much whatever you want here. I've seen people do sound effects, pictures, all sorts of things, parallaxes in some cases. You know, you can get really creative here with the kind of weather you utilise. And also, you can also set up different kind of monsters that only come out in certain types of weather using different switches, but I'll put a tutorial together to explain how that would work. If you don't really know what I mean, if you've ever played Final Fantasy 13-2, I believe it is, then you'll know what I mean. You can change the weather and fight different types of monsters in certain places. So, we've got the weather that's changed. Now what we need to do is basically reset the system. So, weather change needs to turn off. This is the event, so we need to make it so that the weather isn't constantly shifting every second. So this is now turned off. The weather timer event needs to be turned on. Basically to make it so that the timer restarts and restarts the countdown until the next change. Additionally, the weather check event needs to be turned off. Now, this is basically just a double check. We've already turned it off once, but it doesn't hurt to put the control switch in there as well. Strictly speaking, if the switch is off, it will not come on again, it will remain off. But again, it's just good housekeeping to do a double check, because the event will not work if two different common events are trying to happen at the same time, because they are contrary to each other. So basically that's how this system works. It's very simple. If you've got any questions, send me an email or just comment on the website, whatever you want to do. The last thing you need to do is set up your parallel event that's going to take place in the background of the game, the call out of sorts. So as you can see up here in the corner, I've set it. Basically, I've set up a simple event with no graphic. It's a parallel process. The first thing to happen is the control switch where the timer needs to turn on, and then the event is erased. Basically, this is so you haven't got various events clogging up the system, creating lag, especially if someone's using a relatively slow computer. Again, just housekeeping, you know, try to keep it so that there are fewer common events taking place. So I'll show you how this works. Okay, so we've got the game running. We're going to do a new game. So as you can see, it's counting down from 12, which means the random number generator picked whichever number had 12 as its setting. We wait for the counter to stop, and as you can see, events can take place in the background. And again, there's a storm, so we now know that the game has picked out a storm as its weather effect. And as you can see, it's now counting down from 10. Now, this might seem a bit strange with, you know, when it's happening every 10 seconds, but put this over 10 minutes, and it's quite a dynamic little system. So now it's suddenly raining. Very simple stuff. And yeah, there's not much more to say. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you've got anything to add, comment in the box below, or visit my website, www.rpgmakerguru.com.